فلما اكتملنا جميعا تحت الكساء أخذ أبي رسول الله بطرف الكساء وأومى بيده اليمنى إلى السماء وقال: اللهم إنا هؤلاء أهل بيتي وخاصتي وحامتي، لحمهم لحمي ودمهم دمي، يؤلمني ما يؤلمهم ويحزنني ما يحزنهم. أنا حرب لمن حاربهم وسلم لمن سالمهم وعدو لمن عاداهم ومحب لمن أحبهم. إنهم مني وأنا منهم، فاجعل صلواتك وبركاتك ورحمتك وغفرانك ورضوانك علي وعليهم، وأذهب عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. صل على محمد وآل محمد. وقال الله عز وجل: يا ملائكتي ويا سكان سماواتي، إني ما خلقت سماء مبنيا ولا أرضا مدحيا ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. فقال الأمين جبرائيل: يا ربي ومن تحت الكساء؟ فقال عز وجل: هم أهل بيت النبوة ومعدن الرسالة، هم فاطمة وأبوها وبعلها وبنوها. محمد وآل محمد. وقال جبرائيل: يا ربي أتأذن لي أن أهبط إلى الأرض لأكون معهم سادسا؟ فقال الله: نعم قد أذنت لك. فهبط الأمين جبرائيل وقال: السلام عليك يا رسول الله. العلي الأعلى يقرئك السلام ويخصك بالتحية والإكرام ويقول لك: وعزتي وجلالي إني ما خلقت سماء مبنيا ولا أرضا مدحيا ولا قمرا منيرا ولا شمسا مضيا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا لأجلكم ومحبتكم، وقد أذن لي أن أدخل معكم، فهل تأذن لي يا رسول الله؟ فقال رسول الله: وعليك السلام يا أمين وحي الله، إنه نعم قد أذنت لك. فدخل جبرائيل معنا تحت الكساء. اللهم صل على محمد. وقال لأبي: إن الله قد أوحى إليكم يقول: إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. وقال علي لأبي: يا رسول الله أخبرني ما لجلوسنا هذا تحت الكساء من الفضل عند الله. فقال النبي: والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا، ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا إلا ونزلت عليهم الرحمة وحفت بهم الملائكة واستغفرت لهم إلى أن يتفرقوا. فقال علي: إذا والله فزنا وفاز شيعتنا ورب الكعبة. وقال النبي ثانيا: يا علي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واصطفاني بالرسالة نجيا، ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا وفيهم مهموم إلا وفرج الله همه ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه ولا طالب حاجة إلا وقضى الله حاجته. وقال علي إذا والله فزنا وسعدنا وكذلك شيعتنا فازوا وسعدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة. بار دیگر صلوات.
بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات. عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس. عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. تم بھی نہیں ہمیں کو ٹھکرانا. تم بھی نہیں ہمیں کو ٹھکرانا. ہم دنیا کے ٹھکرائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. اب سارے سہارے ٹوٹ چکے. ہمیں اپنے پرائے لوٹ چکے. اب سارے سہارے ٹوٹ چکے. ہمیں اپنے پرائے لوٹ چکے. تمہیں اپنی پناہوں میں لے لو. تمہیں اپنی پناہوں میں لے لو. ہم غم سے بہت گھبرائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. اشکوں کی زبان پہچانتے ہو. جو دل میں ہے وہ جانتے ہو. اشکوں کی زبان پہچانتے ہو. جو دل میں ہے وہ جانتے ہو. ہمیں کہہ نہیں سکتے تم سن لو. ہمیں کہہ نہیں سکتے تم سن لو. بس ہاتھوں کو پھیلائے ہیں. عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس. ساقائے حرم رکھ لے نہ برم. ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں. کھا کھا کے تماچے روتی ہے. زندان کی خاک پہ سوتی ہے. کھا 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 کے تمانچے روتی ہے، زنداں کی خاک پہ سوتی ہے، بجھ جائے پیاس سکینہ کی، بجھ جائے پیاس سکینہ کی، ہمیں آنکھ میں آنسو لائے ہیں۔ عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس، ساقائے حرم رکھ لینا برم، ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں۔ دربار سخی عباس کا تھا، کچھ مانگ نہ تھا لازم مانگا، دربار سخی عباس کا تھا، کچھ مانگ نہ تھا لازم مانگا، لیکن یہ حقیقت بھی ہے قمر، لیکن یہ حقیقت بھی ہے قمر، ہمیں پرسا دینے آئے ہیں۔ عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس، عباس عباس یا بالفضل العباس، ساقائے حرم رکھ لینا برم، ہم در پہ تمہارے آئے ہیں۔ صلوات۔
سکینہ 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 سکینہ، زنداں سے جب رہا ہوئے، سادہ کے کربلا، ہے مانگے لپٹ کے قبرے سکینہ پہ گی صدا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، چھوٹی سی قربات پہ مانگے کہا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، زنداں سے جاتا ہے اب قافلہ، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، مجھے شاہ غزالی تمہاری قسم، نہ رکھوں گی زندہ سے باہر قدم، سفر کی اب ہوتی ہے تیاریاں، ہماری میں بیٹھے اہل حرم، غربت کا میری تمہیں واسطہ، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، ہاں اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، وہ پہلے کے جیسے تو غربت نہیں، اے بی بی ہماری وہ حالت نہیں، تمہیں شامیوں سے اب میری جان کا نہیں، لو مل گئی ہے تمہاری نگاہ، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ مجھے یاد اصغر کی ہے بے کسی، لحد سے وہ میت نکالی گئی، اکیلے میں رہنے نہ دوں گی تمہیں، بھروسہ نہیں شامیوں کا کوئی، رکھے ہیں چاروں طرف اشکیاں، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ چھوٹی سی قربت پہ ماں نے کہا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ یہ شامی کہاں تم کو بہلائیں گے، تمہاری لغت پر نہیں آئیں گے، رہے گا اندھیرا اس زندان میں، حرم جب یہاں سے چلے جائیں گے، کون آئے گا پھر جلانے دیا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ کہانی پدر کی سناؤں گی میں، اگر نیند آئی سناؤں گی میں، اکیلے ننھے پہ بیٹھو گی تم، تمہیں ساتھ اپنے بٹھاؤں گی میں، اب تو رسن میں نہ ہوگا گلا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ بڑی دیر ٹھہری ہے دربار میں، یہاں پر نہ روکو زیادہ انہیں، کہ پہلو پہ ایک ہاتھ رکھے ہوئے صدا دے رہی ہے سکینہ تمہیں، لینے کو آئی ہے خود سیدہ، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ کہ زنداں میں اکبر عجب وہ گھڑی، رہائی پہ روٹی کی خلق پھوپھی، ادھر خون روتا تھا عابد گھر، سکینہ لاد میں تڑپ کی رہی، جب بھی یہ ماگر نے رو کر کہا، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا، زنداں سے جاتا ہے اب قافلہ، اٹھو سکینہ چلے کربلا۔ صلوات۔
بر محمد والے محمد صلوات صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم۔ مختصر صاحب بار دیگر صلوات۔ پیام اعظمی صاحب کا ایک کام، ان اشکوں کے چراغوں کو بجھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، ان اشکوں کے چراغوں کو بجھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، یہ غم حق کی امانت ہے مٹا سکتا نہیں کوئی، ان اشکوں کے چراغوں کو بجھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، جو دل سینے میں ہے زندہ تمہاری یاد آئے گی، جو دل سینے میں ہے زندہ تمہاری یاد آئے گی، تمہیں اے کربلا والو بھلا سکتا نہیں کوئی، گلے پر تیر کھا کر مسکرانا کس کو آتا ہے، گلے پر تیر کھا کر مسکرانا کس کو آتا ہے، جواب اصغر بے شیر لا سکتا نہیں کوئی، اور علی کے لال تیری جرت و ہمت کا کیا کہنا، علی کے لال تیری جرت و ہمت کا کیا کہنا، ضعیفی میں پسر کی لاش اٹھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، ضعیفی میں پسر کی لاش اٹھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، اور سکینہ سے یہ کہتا تھا شب مقتل کا سناٹا، سکینہ سے یہ کہتا تھا شب مقتل کا سناٹا، کسے آواز دیتی ہو اب آ سکتا نہیں کوئی، مقتل سے پیام اب تشنگی 6 ماہ کے بچے کی دنیا میں، پیام اب تشنگی 6 ماہ کے بچے کی دنیا میں، ایک ایسی آگ ہے جس کو بجھا سکتا نہیں کوئی، ان اشکوں کے چراغوں کو بجھا سکتا نہیں کوئی۔
ایک سلوات میں صلی اللہ محمد اس کے ساتھ ایک سورہ فاتحہ جو اسپانسر ہیں اس مجلس کے ان کے لیے. مومنو آج خراساں میں ہے تازہ ماتم، تھر تھر آتے ہیں فلک عرش و زمین لوح و قلم، آتے ہیں آلے ابا خاک اڑاتے باہم، عابد و باخر و جعفر و جناب کاظم، عابد و باخر و جعفر و جناب کاظم، منہ کو سب یہ ہزارات آنسوں سے دھوتے ہیں، جمع میت کے اٹھانے کے لیے، جمع میت کے اٹھانے کے لیے ہوتے ہیں. اور کیا خیر کے بے جرم و خطا تمہارا، دل برے فاطمہ و شیر خدا تمہارا، زہر دلوا کے غریب الغربا تمہارا، آج مامون مظلوم رضا تمہارا، آج مامون مظلوم رضا تمہارا، خاک میں مل گیا ایک اور گل باغ زہرا، گل ہوا آج خراساں میں چراغ زہرا، گل ہوا آج خراساں میں چراغ زہرا. اس طرح واقعہ ہے آج کا راوی نے لکھا، ابن ہارون نے حضرت کو جو ہی بلوایا، آئے دربار میں جس وقت امام دوسرا، تخت پر اپنے خریشہ کو بھی بٹھلایا، تخت پر اپنے خریشہ کو بھی بٹھلایا. پھر کہا شاہ سے فرمائیے تو پیش کروں، آپ کے واسطے انگور میں لے رکھا، آپ کے واسطے انگور میں لے رکھا ہوں. کہا مظلوم نے مجھ کو نہیں انگور کی چاہ، کس لیے سامنے تشت جو تو نے رکھا، کیا اصرار جو اس نے تو امام زیجا کھا کے انگور کو کہنے لگے انا للہ، کھا کے انگور کو کہنے لگے انا للہ. پوچھا مامون نے کیا بات ہے فرمائیے گا، سر جھکا کر کہا مسموم نے معلوم، سر جھکا کر کہا مسموم نے معلوم ہوا، اور کھا کے انگورے دغائے گھر کو اپنے، خے کیے جاتے ہیں پکڑے ہوئے سر کو اپنے، درد ہوتا ہے دباتے ہیں جگر کو اپنے، یاد فرماتے ہیں ہم شیر و پسر کو اپنے، یاد فرماتے ہیں ہم شیر و پسر کو اپنے. اور سید و بے کس و مظلوم غریب الغربا، مضطرب حال مسموم غریب الغربا، مضطرب حال مغموم غریب الغربا. امت کا آ گیا چہرے پہ پسینہ یارو، غش میں ہے وارث سلطان مدینہ یارو، 8واں مہرے نبوت کا نگینہ یارو، خاک میں ملتا ہے احمد کا خزینہ یارو، خاک میں ملتا ہے احمد کا خزینہ یارو، در و دیوار کو حسرت سے رضا دیکھتے ہیں، اور انہیں یاد سے سب آل اور انہیں یاد سے سب آل ابا دیکھتے ہیں، پیٹی ہے کبھی سر کو کبھی تھراتی ہے، فاطمہ اس طرح رونے کے لیے آتی ہے، جانب عرش الا روح رضا جاتی ہے، بے کسی لاش پہ رو رو کے چلاتی ہے، بے کسی لاش پہ رو رو کے چلاتی ہے، موت کی ہچکیاں اب لیتا ہے دل بس کا، 4 حمال اٹھائے تھے جنازہ جس کا، 4 حمال اٹھائے تھے جنازہ جس کا،
صلوات. There is a request for a Surah Fatiha for the families of tonight's sponsors of the Majlis. Please recite a Surah Fatiha for Sayyid Mehdi Raza ibn Sayyid Ali Raza, Sayyid Ali Raza, Habibun Nisa Begum, Sayyid Abbas Hussain, Zinat Begum, Sayyid Sadiq, Sohra Sadiq, Mir Amjad Jafri, Bashir Nisa Begum, Khalil Amjad Jafri, Amir Nisa Begum, Bikhar Hussain Muswi, Sayyid Ahmad Hussain Kazmi, Bilqis Taqi and Shams Rizvi. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. As-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Bismillah. Qul huwallahu ahad. Qul huwallahu ahad. Qul huwallahu ahad. Salawat. Salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Tonight is the third majlis of this series of Arba'in Majalis by this young speaker. He'll be here with us tomorrow and also on a Wednesday. I just want to let you know that on Tuesday night we'll also be having an Urdu section of the program, as well as Wednesday night, an Urdu section of the program on both Tuesday and Wednesday night. On Wednesday morning we have the Amal and then a Majlis immediately after the Amal. I request you all to please take your time off from work. You can take just a couple of hours off, be here at 10, will be done by 12, 12:30, have nazar, and you can go back to work. It is the Imam's hadith that one of the signs of Mu'min is to read the Ziyarat Arba'in. So there are people who have taken days off and they are walking from Najaf to Karbala, from all over to Karbala. This is the least we can do. Just come for the Ziyarat, inshallah, and we'll do the Ziyarat, we'll do the namaz. And then after that we'll have a majlis on Wednesday. It will start sharp at 10 a.m. Also, and then after that, the following weekend, we have a series of 3 majalis, which is Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Maulana Jafar Bengaluri from Florida will be with us, inshallah, those 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I request you all to please attend those majalis also. And one final request before I ask Sayyid to come to the member. I have been asking you before. Once again, I request you all to please help financially to conduct the programs here at Baitul Khaim. Your help really carries a long weight. And those of you who are interested, you can log into the site and watch what IMI is doing in Karbala. And there are more than 180 doctors in Iraq right now. So our community is really working hard. But all that will be possible with your help, inshallah, with your assistance, with your financial help, and also your du'as. With a loud salawat, let's welcome Maulana. Sallallahu Muhammad wa alayhi.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سورة المباركة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين بائت الأنبياء والمرسلين والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين الذي سمي في السماء بالسماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والصولة الحيدرية والإسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمآثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاذمية والحجج الردوية والجود التقوية والنقاوة النقوية والهيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة وجاهدوا في سبيله لعلكم تفلحون صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatimah al-Zahra in particular, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. To give the Imam of our time our condolences as we approach the Arba'een of his grandfather, a louder salawat ala Muhammad. Indeed, one of the most contested discussions when it comes to the realm of Islamic theology is the discussion pertaining to tawassul or placing intermediaries before God. You see, this discussion is a discussion when it comes to the realm of Shia-Sunni dialogue. You find that it is almost at the forefront of the list of discussions. But at a second level, when we look within the world today, there are many within the school of Ahlul Bayt who have brought the discussion of tawassul to question. And this is why when we examine the Muslim world, you find that there are a plethora of views when it comes to this discussion. For example, the Salafi view is very famous, that one cannot place any form of an intermediary before God, otherwise this is a violation of the Tawheed and the unity of Allah. But further than that, you find that there are other Muslims that go towards the grave of the awliya and the saints, and they do tawassul at their graves. For example, when you go to Baghdad, there are many non-Shi'as who go to the grave of Abdul Qadir al-Gilani, for example. And over here, the discussion, it arises that if we as Muslims so adamantly hold on to the concept of Tawheed, that not even in our imagination we can say that there is a partner for Allah, then is this something which we can reconcile with the concept of tawassul when we place the Prophet as an intermediary before Allah? Or we place Imam Ali or Fatimah al-Zahra or any of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt as an intermediary before Allah? You see, because when it comes to our relationship with the Imams, it is not like the relationship of other Muslim groups with their Imams. For example, when somebody says that we are a Hanafi or a Hanbali or a Shafi'i or a Maliki, and we have a relationship with Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal or Imam al-Shafi or Imam al-Malik or Imam Abu Hanifa, their relationship is the relationship of a student to a teacher. that these individuals imparted knowledge in the realm of jurisprudence and they follow the knowledge of these individuals. But the reality is that when it comes to our relationship with the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, it is a relationship where they are an intermediary through which we reach Allah. Now, many will say that at the first level, when you look at the Quran, this violates the Quran. Why? Because the Quran in Surah Kahf, in the 50th chapter, in the 16th verse, it says, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, that we are closer to the human being than the jugular vein. If Allah is closer than the jugular vein, then why not go to Allah directly? Why do you need to place somebody who is farther than Allah? Or further than that, you find that Allah in Surah Al-Baqarah, in chapter 2, verse 186, He says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةُ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ, that when my servant asks about me, tell them that I am near and I answer the dua of the one who supplicates towards me. So you find at both of these levels, Allah is showing that He is closer than any makhluk, than any creation. And if Allah is closer than any makhluk, at the end of the day, Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt are a creation of Allah. So why go to the farther to reach the one who is closer? This is the first question. The second question is that when you look in the Quran, in Surah Al-Zumar, the 39th chapter of the Quran, in the 3rd verse, Allah describes the psychology of the idolaters when they would worship their idols. And the psychology of the idolaters wasn't that they would worship the idols in and of themselves. The Quran over there says that مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفًا. The Quran quotes the idolaters, and the quotation is that they say, we do not worship these idols except to bring us closer to Allah. So the second question that they bring up is that your mindset is the same mindset as these idolaters, that they worship their idols to bring them closer to Allah. You use your imams as an intermediary to take you closer towards Allah. You see, it is important that within the world that we live in, number one, we have an answer to these questions. But number two, it is something that we need to understand ourselves. Because at the end of the day, the concept of tawassul is something that remains before our birth and it continues after our death. In the sense that each of our parents, they would take the tawassul of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt for us to be born healthy. And when we die, each of our family members will have a majlis of Isalut Tawab. And that majlis, the goal of it would be to invoke the tawassul and the intercession of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And that's why tonight I want to discuss this topic in a number of stages. At the first level, we'll examine the concept of tawassul from logic and philosophy. From the second level, we'll examine that are there examples from the Quran about tawassul. From the third level, we'll examine the different types of tawassul, and we'll see which of these types does the Muslim Ummah agree upon and which of these types have been controversial in the Muslim Ummah. From the fourth level, we'll examine the seerah of Rasulullah and see if Rasulullah ever used tawassul. And from the fifth level, we'll examine that what are the reasons behind one when they use tawassul. And based upon these different points, we'll try to come to an understanding about this topic. Now, when it comes to the first level, as I said, we'll examine this topic from the level of logic and philosophy. Because when we know when it comes to our aqaid, there are many areas of aqaid that it is only intellectual pursuit through which we can arrive at it. If I ask you to prove to me the wujud and the existence of Allah, can you say that the Quran says Allah exists, thus Allah exists? No. Because this would be a door and a circular argument. The authority of the Quran comes from the fact that it is the book of Allah. So we need to rationally establish the existence of God, and then after that we move to the next level. In the same way, there is a rational element to the discussion of tawassul. And that rational element is related to the discussion about cause and effect. You know, whenever there is a cause which brings out an effect, number one, there is a muqtadi and something which initiates the effect. Number two, there are shart and there are conditions. And number three, there is adamul mane and there are no obstacles. And I'll give you an example. The example is this, is that when fire burns any object, the muqtadi, that which initiates the burning is what? It's the fire. The fire is what burns. The condition is that the object needs to be close to the fire. And the third condition is there must be no obstacles for the fire to burn that shirt. You see, everything within this world, it goes through the realm of cause and effect. That Allah has created causes and asbab for you to reach your destination. You know, I remember there's an incident of a famous Deobandi scholar who became a Shia by the name of Ismail Deobandi. And one day Ismail Deobandi was a famous munadir and an individual who would engage in debates. He was debating a Salafi individual. He says that individual, when he would place the Quran, I would reply with the Quran. And when he would place the hadith, I would reply with the hadith. At one point, that individual became emotional. And when he became emotional, he took my pen and he threw it on the ground. When he threw it on the ground, he says that you believe in tawassul, say Ya Ali Madad for your pen to be raised and to come back to you. Now Ismail Deobandi, he says Quran, I replied Quran. Hadith, I replied Hadith. Over here, he says that bring it back. He says at that moment, I took the object of that individual, I threw it on the ground, and I said to him, in the way you told me, say Ya Ali Madad for it to come back, I am saying to you, say Ya Allah Madad. You see, the reply is this, is that Allah in this world, He works through cause and effect. At the end of the day, the root is Allah, but the method is the method of cause and effect. You know the Quran, in Surah Al-A'raf, chapter 7, verse 45, it says, Ala lahul khalqu wal amr. It says to Allah belongs the realm of khalq and creation and the realm of amr and command. You know, there is a big difference between the realm of amr and the realm of khalq. And the difference is this, is that when it comes to the realm of God's command, there is no wasila and tawassul over there. Because the Quran in Surah Yasin, it says, إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا أَن يَقُولَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونَ. That when Allah intends something, He says to it, be, and it becomes. And in reality, the intention of Allah is His action. Otherwise, this is wording to make us understand. Over here, anything within that realm, there is no tawassul. إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا أَن يَقُولَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونَ. That is why when it comes to the soul, Allah didn't create the soul via an intermediary. The Quran says, فَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ فَقُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. The ruh is of the amr of Allah. And that which is in the amr of Allah, Allah says be and it becomes. But when it comes to the realm of khalq and creation, everything within the realm of khalq and creation, it works through cause and effect, whether we understand that cause or we don't understand that cause. You know, there is a famous line in Surah Al-Shu'ara, chapter 26, verse 80 of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. And over there, Nabi Ibrahim, he says, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِ. That when I am sick, Allah is the one who cures me. Now, how does Allah cure an individual? At one level, there is a wasila which is maddi and material. That, oh human being, that when you are ill, take medicine. Medicine is a wasila for you to be cured. Is there anyone in the Muslim ummah saying that medicine is a bid'ah, it is an innovation, it is shirk? No, no one says such a thing. So you find at one level, there is a wasila which is material. But at the second level, there can be a wasila in the ghaib as well. That when a person is sick, they make dua, for example. When a person is sick, they give sadaqah, for example. You know, the sixth Imam would say that tasaddaqu wadawu mardakum bis sadaqah, that give sadaqah and cure the sick members amongst you by giving sadaqah. This shows that in the ghaib there are wasail as well. And these take you towards the effect, even though the cause is Allah. At the end of the day, Allah is the one who cures. But the medium is this medicine, the medium is this dua. So you find this is that reality. But now at the second level, those individuals who say that Allah is closer than the jugular vein, why is it that you need an intermediary if Allah is that close? You find that in this question there is a philosophical mistake. And that philosophical mistake lies in the fact that they think that distance is the same at both levels. And this is something which is counterintuitive. You know, if I said that Dr. Asad Sadiq is 5 feet from me, then naturally I am 5 feet from him. In this world, the distance is the same both ways. But when you look at the Quran is not saying that you are close to Allah. The Quran is saying, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, that we are closer than the jugular vein. Or it says, فَلَوْلَا إِذَا بَلَغَتِ الْحُلْقُومِ وَأَنْتُمْ هِينَئِذٍ تَنْظُرُونَ وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْكُمْ وَلَكِنْ لَا تُبْصِرُونَ. It is saying that at the death of a person and when their soul reaches their throat, we are closer to them than you. So time and time again, when you examine the Quran will not say that you are close to Allah, but it is saying that Allah is close to you. What it is showing is that there is one type of closeness which is al-qurbul waqi'i. That, O human being, no matter what mistake you make, no matter what sin you do, existentially Allah is always close to you no matter what you do. But then there is al-qurbul ruhani. But at your spiritual level, sometimes you are close to Allah and sometimes you are distant from Allah. And when you have distanced yourself from Allah, you find that there are intermediaries in this world of cause and effect which take you back towards Allah. That's why when you look at the Quran shows that there are different types of intermediaries. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 145, Allah says, وَاتَّخِذُوا مِن مَقَامِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ مُصَلًّى, that take that maqam where the Prophet Ibrahim would stand as a place of prayer. I say, oh Allah, the entire world belongs to you. Whether I pray in the masjid, or I pray in my home, or if I pray in the maqam of Nabi Ibrahim, or I pray in Karbala, at the end of the day, you are the one who accepts my salat and you'll hear my salat. But over here, the Quran is showing that one form of wasila is that there are certain places which have a spiritual closeness to Allah. And if you pray at those places, it facilitates your journey towards Allah. So if we have a tradition that says that the one who does the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, it is as if he has done the ziyarah of Allah fawqa arshihi. This is not something which contradicts the Quran. Because the ziyarah of Allah fawqa arsh, of course Allah does not literally have an arsh, but this is a representation of closeness. So you find if one prays at the maqam of Ibrahim and gains closeness, or he prays in Karbala and gains closeness, the Quran has given us a precedent that a place can have a spiritual closeness towards Allah and it can serve as a wasila. You find this is one example. The second example is that there are certain time periods where a wasila as well. We all recognize there are certain time periods when our spirituality is heightened. And there are certain time periods when our spirituality takes a step back. You know, Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ, that we revealed the Quran on the night of Qadr, and you will not comprehend what the night of Qadr is. وَلَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أَلْفِ شَهْرٍ. The night of Qadr is better than 1,000 months. Allah is showing, O human being, There is also a wasila in time that I have given certain days on the calendar that if you engage in my ibadat on those days, you are making a journey which is significantly greater than doing my ibadat on other days. And it is because I place barakah and blessing within those days. So if we have a tradition that says that the one who does the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein on the 15th of Sha'ban, it is as if he has shaken the hands of 124,000 prophets. The Quran has already given us a precedent that there are certain times where your ibadat are heightened. So you find this is a second example. The third example in the Quran is in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 45. You know what Allah says in that verse? Allah says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ista'inu bis-sabri was-salat. That seek help with patience and salat. At the end of the day, sabr is ghayrullah. Salat is ghayrullah. The Quran says, Iyaka nasta'in, we only ask you for help. Then the Quran is saying, seek help through sabr and salat. There is no one in the Muslim ummah that says this is a contradiction over here. The Quran is showing there are certain actions that they are beloved to Allah. And if you carry out those actions, it is a means of closeness for you towards Allah. This was a third example. The fourth example from the Quran is that the Quran is showing that sometimes even an object can be a means of closeness to Allah. You know, the Quran in Surah Yusuf, chapter 12, verse 93, after Yaqub was separated from his son Yusuf and he cried so much وَبْيَدَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ that he became blind from his sorrow, eventually the story goes that the brothers of Yusuf, they meet Yusuf when he is the economic minister. Yusuf asks about his father, and as the brothers are returning, the Quran, it quotes Nabi Yusuf in chapter 12, verse 93. And you know what the quotation is? The quotation is this, is that idhabu bi qamisi hada fa alquhu ala wajhi abi ya'ti basira. That Nabi Yusuf says that take this shirt of mine, place this shirt on the face of my father's vision will come back. Nabi Yusuf could have said, tell my father to make dua. But the Quran is showing that sometimes an object, if it has a nisbat to a Nabi, if it is something which has a nisbat to that which pleases Allah, then there is shifa within that object as well. That is why when the hadith says khaqul shifa brings shifa to an individual, you find the precedent has already been given. So you find this is that reality which is there. Now this was another example. Now we go further. The Quran in the same chapter, 12 verses 96, 97. Now the brothers of Yusuf, they recognize their mistake. And when they recognize their mistake, they say, Ya Abana, istaghfir lana inna kunna khati'in. That, oh our father, make dua for us. In other words, the Quran is showing that at the very minimum, number one, either another mu'min can be a form of tawassul within this world by making dua, or at the higher level, the Nabi and the Prophet, who is the highest example of Iman, can be a form of tawassul within this world. So you find that the Quran is demonstrating this. But as we look at all of the different ayat of the Quran, the clearest example of tawassul within the Quran is Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 35. Within this verse, Allah, He could not have stated it any more clearly. You know what Allah says? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, ittaqullah, O you who believe, have taqwa. وَابْتَغُوا إِلَيْهِ الْوَسِيلَةِ, and seek a wasila, an intermediary towards Allah. You know, when you look at many of the tafasir of those famous Salafi scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah, or somebody who comes much later like Nasiruddin al-Albani, they'll say that wasila over here means amal salih and righteous action. I say, how many times in the Quran does Allah use the word amal salih? If Allah meant righteous action, he would have used the word righteous action. You do not have a right to reinterpret the wording of the Quran for it to suit your ideology. Over here, Allah says the word wasila. And literally in the Arabic language, wasila is a means to reach a destination or a means to reach something else. Over here, the Quran is showing that, O human being, take a wasila towards Allah. But the Quran doesn't describe in this ayat what that wasila is. The verse is unrestricted. There is no restriction over there. So if the verse is unrestricted, then it is upon us to look at the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt to see what different forms of wasila they use. Because when you look, you find that there are about 7 to 8 different forms of tawassul. And some of these forms, the entire Muslim Ummah agrees upon, and some of these forms have been a point of controversy. For example, the first form of tawassul is to do tawassul by the names of Allah. Over here, the entire Muslim Ummah is in agreement. There is no one who says that do not call upon the names of Allah. Because the Quran, it says, وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. To Allah belong the best of names. That's why within our school of thought, we find Dua Joshan al-Kabir. What is Joshan al-Kabir? Joshan is an armor. And that armor is just the names of Allah. Allahumma inni asaluka ya Allahu ya Rahmanu ya Muqimu ya Karimu, etc. Even when you look outside of the Shia world, you find that there are many du'as where they take the names of Allah. You know, there's a narration in the Sunan of At-Tirmizi where Abdullah ibn Burayda narrates from his father that one day my father was reciting the dua, Allahumma inni ashhadu annaka bi anni anta Allah, al-ahadu samadu alladhi lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Over here, the names of Allah were being taken, and you find that Rasulullah praised this dua. You see, when we say that we are taking the names of Allah, it does not just mean that we are reciting those names upon our tongue. The recitation upon the tongue is just a form of the dhikr of Allah. But it is not the dhikr of Allah in its essence. You know, the Quran, it says, فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَذِكْرِكُمْ آبَاءَكُمْ أَوْ أَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا. That remember Allah in the way that you remember your fathers, or with an even more intense remembrance. You know, when somebody mentions your father, it is not just his name which comes to your tongue, but it is all of those sentiments and those memories that when I was nothing, that individual would help me. The Quran is saying that when you remember Allah, there should be an inner emotional connection to God. There should be an inner spiritual connection to Allah. So you find that the dhikr of Allah is much deeper. And in that level, it serves as an intermediary to reaching Allah. So you find this is the first form of tawassul. The second form of tawassul that we see in the Quran and the Sunnah is to do tawassul by the Quran itself. That is why when you look within the Muslim Ummah, there is a hadith that you find in Sahih al-Muslim. The Ravi is Imran ibn al-Hussein. And he says that Rasulullah said to me that Iqra'ul Quran was'alullaha tabarak wa ta'ala bihi qabla an yaji'a qawmun yas'aluna bihin nas. That Rasulullah said in Sahih al-Muslim that read the Quran and ask Allah by the right of the Quran. Before a group of individuals comes that begs from the people using this Quran. In other words, we can say, oh Allah, I ask through the right of this Quran to give me my hajat. What do we do on the night of Qadr? On the night of Qadr, we place the Quran, we open it in front of us, we place it upon our head, and we say that, oh Allah, I ask through the right of the Quran, وَفِيهِ أَسْمَاهُكَ الْحُسْنَى. Because within this Quran are the best of your names. So in that regard, a person can use the Quran as an intermediary. But the reality of that is only when you have a relationship with the Quran. You know, when we look at the ashab of Imam al-Hussein, Burayr ibn al-Khudayr is one of the famous companions. You know, At-Tabari in his Tarikh would write that Burayr was Sayyidul Qurra bil Kufa. That within Kufa, he was amongst the best of the reciters of the Quran. And further than that, what do we have in the narration? We have in the narration that many of these individuals were so familiar with the Quran that when they would speak, they would often use the Quran in their dialogue. You know, it is very famous that one day Janab-e-Fidda, she meets a famous Sufi by the name of Abdullah al-Mubarak in the desert. And Abdullah al-Mubarak, he sees a lady in the desert by herself. This is something which is not common, it's strange. So he says to her that, who are you? You know what she replies? She says, وَقُلْ سَلَامٌ فَسَوْفَ يَعْلَمُونَ. That says salam and soon they will know a verse of the Quran. In other words, he understood that she wants me to say Assalamu alaikum. So after that, I said to you, are you lost? She says, وَمَن يَهْدِ اللَّهِ فَمَا لَهُ مِن مُضَلٍّ. The one whom Allah guides is never lost. In other words, I am lost at this moment. He begins to worry. He says, 2 questions, 2 times she replies from the Quran. So at that moment I say, are you a human? Are you a jinn? She says, Ya Bani Adam khudu zinatakum inda kulli masjid. That, O son of Adam, adorn yourself at that spot of prayer. He says, from that I understood that she is a human being. I said to her that, where are you coming from? She says, Ulaika yunaduna min maqamin ba'id. That they call from a far off place, meaning I am coming from a far off place. He says, okay, where are you going? She says, Walillahi ala nasi hajjul bayt. That for Allah, wajib is to go towards Hajj, I'm going to Hajj. He says, how long have you been lost for? She says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَامٍ. That we created the heavens and the earth and what is in between in 6 days. I have been lost for 6 days. After that, you find that that man, he says, are you hungry? It has been 6 days. وَمَا جَعَلْنَاهُمْ جَسَدًا لَا يَأْكُلُونَ الطَّعَامِ. That we have not made them bodies that do not eat food. Yes, I am hungry. So after that, that man, he notices a caravan in the distance. And he says to her that run, catch up to that caravan, they're going in your direction. She says, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. That Allah does not task a soul more than it cannot handle. It is not in my capability to catch up to that. So the man says, okay, you ride on my horse, you sit behind me, I'll sit up front and we'll catch up to that caravan. She says, لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. That if there was any God besides Allah, there would be corruption in the heavens and the earth. In other words, you are my non-mahram. The wording over here is that if I were to sit next to you, this would be fasad and corruption. It is not appropriate. So after that, they're going. She sits on the horse, on the camel, whatever it was, and he walks next to her. In the distance, he notices that there are some young men. And he says to her that, do you recognize these young men? She replies with 4 ayat from the Quran. She says, Ya Dawood, inna ja'alnaka khalifatan fil ard. That Dawood, we have made you a khalifa. Wama Muhammadun illa Rasul. Muhammad is nothing but a messenger. Ya Yahya khudil kitaba bi khuquba. That, O Yahya, hold on to the book with strength. Ya Musa inni an Allah. O Musa inni an Allah. He said, from that I understood that their names are Dawood, Muhammad, Yahya, and Musa. So I said, who are these individuals? She says, Al-malu wal-banun zinatul hayat ad-dunya. That your children and your wealth are the endowments of the life of this world. These are my children. When she sees her children, she says, Ista'jirhu. Inna khayra man ista'jarta al-qawiyul amin. that give this individual a wage. For the best person you can give a wage is the one who is qawi and strong and ami and honest. In other words, he has helped me, so help him. So after that, the children, they give money to that man. When they give money to that man, she says, "Man dalladhi yaqrudullaha qardan hasana fayudha'ifahu lahu." That the one whom gives Allah a good loan, Allah increases for that person. In other words, you didn't give enough, give more to this individual. You see, the companions of Ahlul Bayt had a relationship with the Quran. And when you have a relationship with the Quran in this dunya, the Quran is a wasila. In the akhirat, the Quran is a source of shafa'ah. So you find when we examine the different forms of tawassul, the first form of tawassul is by the names of Allah. The second form of tawassul is by the Quran. These two forms, the entire Muslim ummah agrees. The third form of tawassul is by a righteous action. I already gave you the example, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu ista'inu bis sabri was salat. That through sabr and through salat seek help. And in this regard, on this topic, there is another verse of the Quran. And that verse of the Quran, it says, وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَائِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَاعِيلُ رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. You know what the Quran says? It says when Ibrahim and Ismail, they laid the foundations of the Kaaba. After they laid the foundations of the Kaaba, they turned to Allah and they said, "Oh Allah, accept from us, وَجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمِينَ لَكَ رَبَّنَا وَجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمِينَ لَكَ and make us those who submit towards you." The Quran is giving an ishara. It is not saying sarahatan and outwardly, but it is giving an ishara and an indication that, O human being, after you do any action in the cause of Allah, in the path of Allah, anything that pleases Allah, then that is that moment where you make dua. You know, in our majalis, we make dua after we recite the Masayib of Imam al-Hussein. Why? Because that is that moment when the hearts have become softened. You know, there's an expression that you hear in Hadith and the Quran all the time, qaswatul qalb, the hardening of the hearts. What does this mean? You know, and I'll give you a very simple explanation and example to explain this. You know, when children are young, they play with Play-Doh. You know, Play-Doh, that clay, when it is soft, you can turn it into any form. But if you leave the cap overnight without it, it becomes hard. The moment it becomes hard, it is not able to accept that form at that moment. The heart of a human being is the same way. When the heart of a human being is softened, it is able to accept the rahmah of Allah. You know, Allah's rahmah and tajalli is always there. There is no problem in the supply. The problem is only in our capacity to accept it. When our heart is soft, we accept it. But when the heart is constricted and it is hardened, you find that it is not able to accept it. That is why whenever you do an action in the cause of Allah, that action becomes a form of tawassul to reaching Allah. That is why in dua tawassul, what do we say at the end of this dua? We say, وَبِحُبِّكُمْ وَبِقُرْبِكُمْ أَرْجُو نَجَاةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ. O Allah, I place my hopes in salvation through the love of these individuals. And I place my hopes in salvation through my closeness towards these individuals. You see, their love is something which is a true form of love. You know, the Quran demonstrates that sometimes there is love which stems from your shahwa and your desires. Sometimes there is a love because of your human interaction. But then the Quran, it also says, وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. That mankind has an immense love for goodness. In other words, when you look within the world, every human being loves beauty. And every human being loves kamal and perfection. But they are not able to recognize that kamal and perfection. When it comes to the love of Allah, in our nature, the love of perfection is their taswi love Allah. In our nature, the love of a perfect human being is their taswi love Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. You know, I remember there was a Christian in Lebanon, and his name was Boulis Salama. This individual, he wrote a fascinating line of poetry for Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And you know what those lines of poetry it say? They say, Jal jalal haqqu fil masihi, hatta sara min furti hubbihi alawiya. That the truth has unveiled upon this Christian to the point that out of his extremity of his love for Ali ibn Abi Talib, he has become Alawi. Ana man a'shaqul fadilata wal ilhama wal adla wal khalqa radiya. And why do I say that even though I am a Christian, I am Alawi and a lover of Ali? It is because I love virtue and inspiration and justice, and I love noble character. Thus, I love Ali ibn Abi Talib. Then after that, he says, listen to the next line. فَإِذَا لَمْ يَكُنْ عَلِيٌّ نَبِيًّا فَلَقَدْ كَانَ خُلْقُهُ نَبَوِيًّا. If Ali himself was not a prophet, then the character of Ali, at least that was prophetic in its nature. That in other words, he is not a Nabi, but his akhlaq is like the akhlaq of the Anbiya. So at this level, you find this love is khalis. This is a love of perfection. And in this way, love itself is an amal through which we can say, oh Allah, that I do tawassul by the love of these individuals. So I gave you the example. The first form of tawassul is by the names of Allah. The second is by the Quran. The third is by an action. The fourth form of tawassul is through the dua of another mu'min. You know, this is something which is self-evident. There are many traditions that say that when you make dua for 40 individuals before yourself, Allah accepts that dua. Because one philosophy of dua is that it takes away selfishness from an individual. You know, the famous narration of Imam al-Hassan is there that I saw my mother all night worshipping in her mihrab. And as she's worshipping in her prayer niche, she prays for other individuals, one after another. So I said to my mother that you have prayed for everyone but the members of this house. So Janab-e-Zahra, she says, Al-Jar Tummaddar. That first the neighbors, then the members of the house. So you find this is the fourth example of tawassul. This is something clear, so it's not something I'll go in depth on. But the fifth level of tawassul is that can you ask Rasulullah to make dua for you after the Prophet has died? You know, as long as Rasulullah is alive and present, is able to help, no Muslim has an objection. Over here, the question is that after the death of Rasulullah, can I say, Ya Rasulullah, remember me in front of Allah, for example? And over here, the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 64, it says, وَلَوْ أَنَّهُمْ إِذْ ظَلَمُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ جَاءُوكَ فَاسْتَغْفَرُوا اللَّهَ وَاسْتَغْفَرَ لَهُمُ الرَّسُولُ لَوَجَدُوا اللَّهَ تَوَّابًا رَحِيمًا. You know what the ayat says? It says, when they have done zulm upon themselves, and they have wronged themselves, number one, if they come to you, O Prophet. Number two, they ask for istighfar from Allah. Number three, you make istighfar for them, only then Allah will be merciful. I say if this ayat was restricted to the life of Rasulullah, then we cannot act upon this ayat. This would mean that the Quran is only limited to the ashab of Rasulullah. But the fact that this verse is saying, go to the Prophet, it is a command, O human being, whether you are the companions of Rasulullah, whether it is 1400 years later, then even then you have to go to Rasulullah, and it is only when Rasulullah makes dua for you and istighfar for you, only then will you find forgiveness in the eyes of Allah. So you find this is one element. But then there is another level to this discussion. Because I said the next form of tawassul was by the dua of Rasulullah after the Prophet has died. The sixth form of tawassul is by the zat of the Prophet himself. That I say, oh Allah, I ask through the right of the Prophet. To prove this, we need to establish that there is a link between this world and those who pass away from this world. Because if there is no link, then there is no point of going to the messenger. But if there is a link, then there is a possibility that Rasulullah can benefit us in that regard. Over here in the Quran, there's a very famous verse. And I guarantee most of you have only heard the first part of this verse. The Quran in chapter 3, verse 169 and verse 170, it says, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Many times people on the manabir, they'll quote this verse and they'll say this proves tawassul. I say this in and of itself doesn't prove tawassul. Because all it says is do not think that those who are killed in the way of Allah are dead and they received sustenance from Allah. The first part of this verse, all it is showing is that they have a great maqam from Allah. But when the verse it continues, it shows that these individuals are aware of those who are in this dunya. And when they are aware of those who are in this dunya, you find that they are happy at their actions. You know what it says? It says, فَرِحِينَ بِمَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. What Allah gives these shuhada, they are pleased with it. They are happy. وَيَسْتَبْشِرُونَ بِالَّذِي لَمْ يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ. It says those who remained within this world, they rejoice when they see those individuals. The Quran over here is showing that an individual who is killed in the way of Allah is able to recognize who are within this dunya. You know, there's a hadith in Bukhari that one day Abdullah ibn Umar is with Rasulullah. And Rasulullah is going past the bodies of the shuhada of Badr. And he begins to speak to them. Abdullah ibn Umar says, Rasulullah, these individuals are dead. Rasulullah says, Hum asma'a minka. They are not dead, they hear more than you hear. Because you hear, you are in ghafla, you are in heedlessness. But when they hear, they understand that reality. So this hadith is showing that there is a connection between this world and those who have passed away. And that ayat is showing there is a connection between those who have passed away and this world. That is why when you go to the Sunan of Ibn Majah, over there you find that there is a narrator who quotes a narration. And he says that one day Rasulullah was there. He said to me, say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bin nabiyyaka nabiyya rahma. That say, oh Allah, I asked you through the right of your messenger, the messenger of mercy. That individual, the Rabi, is Uthman ibn Hunayf. He says, after I made this dua, I turned to Allah and I said, Ya Muhammad, atawassalu bika ila rabbi fi hajati lituqda. That, O Muhammad, I turned to Allah through you for my hajat. In other words, this hadith is establishing that it was the sunnah of the companions of the Prophet to turn using the name of Rasulullah. And At-Tabarani quotes another narration. He says in the time of Uthman ibn Affan, there was a man who came to Uthman. He asked for help. Uthman didn't help that individual. So Uthman ibn Hunayf gave this dua to that man, and that man recited that dua. Uthman ibn Affan was Khalifa after the death of Rasulullah, logically in itself very clear. You find after the death of Rasulullah, they were doing tawassul by the Prophet Muhammad. But over here, the final question that I want to get towards before my time comes to an end. Is there any example in the seerah of Rasulullah where Rasulullah did tawassul? And why this question is important is because at the beginning of this lecture, I proposed the question that Allah is closer than the jugular vein. And as Muslims, everything is less than Allah, even as Prophet, even the Ahlul Bayt. So why is it that we go to the lesser to reach the greater and the one who is closer? The reason the sunnah of Rasulullah is important is because Rasulullah is the greatest of God's creation. Rasulullah's du'as are mustajab. Rasulullah does not need a wasila. anyone who is a wasila is lesser than a Rasulullah. You know, as Ayatollah Abu al-Hasan al-Isfahani would say, that ma al-kalimu wa ma al-asa wa ma al-hajaru. That who was Musa, what was the staff of Musa and that stone which Musa would strike for the water to come out? Fi sabbabatihi shukkal kamaru. Rasulullah is the one, he didn't have to speak. He pointed with his finger and the moon had split in half, as the Quran it says. So this prophet, if he uses a wasila, this establishes that you can go to the lesser to reach the greater. And I say on the day of Mubahila, when the verse it says, فَقُلْ تَعَالَوْا نَدْعُوا أَبْنَاءَنَا وَأَبْنَاءَكُمْ وَنِسَاءَنَا وَنِسَاءَكُمْ وَأَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ. That, O Prophet, call yourselves, call your women, call your children. On that day, Rasulullah, behind him was Janab Zahra. Behind her was Amir al-Mu'mineen. He held the hand of Imam al-Hassan, in his arm was Imam al-Hussein, and he turned to his Ahlul Bayt and he said, فَإِذَا دَعَوْتُ فَأَمِّنُوا. That when I make dua, you say Ameen. I say, O Rasulullah, your dua is always accepted. O Rasulullah, nobody has to say Ameen to your dua. But Rasulullah on that day established that I, Muhammad, who needs no wasila, if I am using a wasila, then it is these 5 individuals. That in other words, he was showing his ummah that when you do tawassul by my Ahlul Bayt. You see, one of the reasons that we do tawassul through this Ahlul Bayt is because we seek to establish an emotional connection with these individuals. That these are not just figures who lived in history that are recorded for us on a piece of paper, but rather these are individuals who continue to impact our life until today. And one of those individuals was Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Ridha. You know, I recited the Masaib of Imam al-Ridha in depth yesterday. But there is one line of musibah that I left for this night. You know, I quoted that as Di'bal, he recited his lines of poetry. The Imam said, "Oh Di'bal, can I finish your poetry?" The Imam then said, وَقَبْرٌ بِطُوسٍ يَا لَهَا مِن مُصِيبَةٍ. That, oh Di'bal, there will be one grave in Khurasan, a grave in Tus whose musibah will be great. You know, the narration, it says that within that house there was a sister of Imam al-Ridha who heard these lines. And when she heard these lines, at that moment she began to cry. I say, oh Fatima Ma'suma, you only heard about the martyrdom of your brother. You weren't like Zainab, who on the day of Ashura would stand. وَالشِّمَرْ جَالِسٌ عَلَى صَدْرِ الْحُسَيْنِ. That Shimar would sit upon the chest of Imam al-Hussein. And Zainab would watch helplessly at that moment. Yes, Imam al-Ridha, when he was on his deathbed, he said, remove the mattress, remove the roofing. Let me remember the masaib of my grandfather. Without a doubt, Imam al-Ridha would remember the masaib of his aunt Zainab, that she would go from Kufa to Sham. You know, when this caravan of Ahlul Bayt, it reaches Kufa, it stated that many individuals would come towards them. And one narration, it says that a lady comes to the caravan of Ahlul Bayt, and they see the daughter of Imam al-Hussein, Sakina. When she sees Sakina, she says, oh girl, I have brought sadaqah and charity for you. Sayyidah Zainab says, oh lady, we are from that household that does not accept sadaqah. Then that lady says, can this girl make a dua for me? Sakina, she raises her hand. You know what that lady she says, in the way that you are yatim, pray that my children never become yatim and orphan. And in the way that you are asir and captive, pray that my children never become captives. And then she says, pray that I go towards Medina. The moment Sayyidah Zainab hears Medina, she says, oh lady, who do you know in Medina? She says, I know the house of Rasulullah. I know the house of Ali. I know the house of Fatima. At that moment, Sayyidah Zainab says, oh Habiba, that is that of Hussein, the son of Ali and Fatima. Oh Habiba, I am Zainab, Habiba. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون ماتم حسين يا حسين.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، ارض و سما میں شور ہے برپا غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، کہتے ہیں پیٹ پیٹ کے سر بے کس و غریب، کہتے ہیں پیٹ پیٹ کے سر بے کس و غریب، سر سے ہمارے اٹھ گیا سایہ غریب کا، ارض و سما میں شور ہے برپا غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، انگور زہردار اترتے ہی حلق سے، انگور زہردار اترتے ہی حلق سے، ہے ہوا دو قلب میں پارا غریب کا، ارض و سما میں شور ہے برپا غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، کوئی نہ تھا کرے جو کفالت امام کی، کوئی نہ تھا کرے جو کفالت امام کی، لاشا تقی نے آ کے اٹھایا غریب کا، ارض و سما میں شور ہے برپا غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، سمسان کی یہ عرض ہے رو رو کے مومنوں، سمسام کی یہ عرض ہے رو رو کے مومنوں، دو دختر رسول کو پرسا غریب کا، ارض و سما میں شور ہے برپا غریب کا، غربت میں اٹھ رہا ہے جنازہ غریب کا، یا حسین
آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، تو اس کی ہواؤں میں ہے یہ کیسی بے چینی، ہر طرف فضاؤں میں ہے یہ بے کلی کیسی، گونجتی ہے ہر گھر میں اب صدائے ماتم کی، گونجتی ہے ہر گھر میں اب صدائے ماتم کی، اس امام کے غم میں سب کی آنکھ ہے پرنم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، ایک غریب و بے کس کو کس نے زیر دے ڈالا، اس امام حشتم پر ہو گیا ستم کیسا، کروٹیں بدلتے ہیں خاک پر شہ والا، کروٹیں بدلتے ہیں خاک پر شہ والا، دل کو تام کر مولا خون گلتے ہیں پہ ہم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج دل برے کاظم ہم سے ہو گیا رخصت، کیا بیاں کرے کوئی اس غریب کی حالت، کیسی ہے یہ تنہائی ہائے کیسی ہے غربت، کیسی ہے یہ تنہائی ہائے کیسی ہے غربت، اب وطن سے دوری ہے بے کسی کا ہے عالم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، ہوتا ہے دو عالم میں غم امام ضامن کا، کر رہے ہیں سب ماتم، سب کے لب پہ ہے نوحہ، لو جنازہ اٹھتا ہے آج اس کا واویلا، لو جنازہ اٹھتا ہے آج اس کا واویلا، کھانا جس کا غربت میں کوئی مون سو ہمدم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، ایک بہن پر ٹوٹا ہے بھائی کا یہ غم کیسا، خاک اڑا کے روتی ہے آج قم کی معصومہ، کہہ رہی ہے رو رو کے مر گیا میرا بھیا، کہہ رہی ہے رو رو کے مر گیا میرا بھیا، کیا کروں میں اب جی کر کون ہے میرا ہمدم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، آ گیا تقی پر ہے دور اب یتیمی کا، کم سنی کے عالم میں ہائے درد ہے کیسا، سر سے اٹھ گیا ان کے آج باپ کا سایہ، سر سے اٹھ گیا ان کے آج باپ کا سایہ، اس امام کو پرسا دیتے ہیں رشید اب ہم، آج ہے خراساں میں ایک غریب کا ماتم، یا حسین
آبگ کو جہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیاتا جاتا ہے، ایک پھول ہے کسی کو کانٹوں پر، ایک پھول ہے کسی کو کانٹوں پر گنگنا کے چلایا جاتا ہے، ابھی ہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے جمایا جاتا ہے، ابھی کو جہاں غشیاتا آباش کی غیرت سے اکثر آبگ کی اسیری پوچھ کی ہے، آباش کی غیرت سے اکثر آبگ کی اسیری پوچھ کی ہے، کیا 4 برس کی بینگا کو، کیا 4 برس کی بینگا کو زندہ میں سلایا جاتا ہے، آبگ جہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے یا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیاتا ہے گلوں سے سادات کے خیمے جلتے ہیں شوروں میں گری گئے آل نبی، سادات کے خیمے جلتے ہیں شوروں میں گری ہے آل اجنبی پھر اجنبی کی بیٹی پر، پھر اجنبی کی بیٹی پر دروازہ گرایا جاتا ہے، آبگ ہاں غشیا کا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیا کا ہے رے رے کے شیگی گیکھ کے ہے نیشیش شکینہ کی جانب، رے رے کے شیگی گیکھ کے ہے نیشیش شکینہ کی جانب، لگتا ہے کہ پوچھ کے ناکا سے، لگتا ہے کہ پوچھ کے ناکا سے پکھی کو گرایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیا کا ہے گلوں سے آتا ہے، آبگ کو جگہ بی بی کو قریب لاش جلی، گلوں کی اذیت دیتے ہیں، ہائے بی بی کو قریب لاش جلی، گلوں کی اذیت دیتے ہیں، عباس کو قریب پانے کے لیے، عباس کو قریب پانے کے لیے زینب کو ستایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جگہ غشیا کا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیا کا ہے غیرت کے سبب جس بی بی نے گھر میں بنا گے کھائی گا، غیرت کے سبب جس بی بی نے گھر میں بنا گے کھائی گا، بے پر گاؤں سے لانے کے لیے، بے پر گاؤں سے لانے کے لیے دربار سجایا جاتا ہے، اب کو جہاں غشیا کا ہے گلوں سے جگایا جاتا ہے، آبگ کو جہاں غشیا کا ہے گلوں سے یا حسین یا حسین
تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی باپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی باپا، تیرا کبر سینے پہ جس کے مارا تھا نیزہ، اہل جفا نے مارا تھا نیزہ، اہل جفا نے روئی کربل کی زمین بھگا تھی رہ گزاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا قاسم گہروں نے جس کو پامال مقتل میں کر دیا تھا، پامال مقتل میں کر دیا تھا، ہائے وہ تنہا تھا سرے مقتل ہزاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں، تیرا ماتم شہدی تیرا غازی چھوٹا ہے روتی ہے دریا فلک ہے سوگواروں میں تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے تیرا صغیر ہاتھوں پہ تیرے مارا گیا جب تیرے ستم سے مارا گیا جب چائے مکتل میں خزاں فگا تھی یہ بہاروں میں تیرا ماتم تم شہدی تیرا گھر کو امت نے لوٹا خیمے جلائے چھینی نے دائیں خیمے جلائے چھینی نے دائیں دیتے تھی زہرا دلا سے دل فگاروں میں تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں تیرا ماتم شہدی بپا ہے چاند تاروں میں یا حسین
صلی اللہ علیہ یا رسول اللہ السلام علیک یا نبی اللہ السلام علیک یا حبیب اللہ السلام علیک یا خاتم النبیین والمرسلین السلام علیک یا ابا الحسن علی ابن ابی طالب امیر المومنین السلام علیک یا فاطمہ سیدت نساء العالمین السلام علیکم الحسن والحسین سیدِ شباب اہل الجنہ السلام علیکم ائمۃ المسلمین علی ابن الحسین ومحمد ابن علی وجعفر ابن محمد وموسى ابن جعفر وعلي ابن موسى ومحمد ابن علي وعلي ابن محمد والحسن ابن علي والحجة ابن الحسن القائم